our next speaker, Professor Edwards, will jump to our next session about the technology session with the crypto focus. And we would like to welcome our next speaker, who is Dr. Juan Garay from Texas A&M University. Dr. Garay is a full professor at the Texas A&M University's Computer Science and Engineering Department. Previously, he held research positions at IBM, Watson Research Center, Bell Labs, AT&T Research, and Yahoo Research. He has been involved in the design, analysis, and implementation of a variety of secure systems, and is a recipient of the Thomas Edison Patent Award and 2 Bell Labs Teamwork Awards. And on top of this, I was informed that your postdoc was here in Israel in the Weizmann Institute. So we're happy to welcome you back here for this conference. It's our pleasure, and please, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Let me share my screen. Okay, so good evening, everybody. And first, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to participate. Should be a lot of fun. And second, I should admit that this is a somewhat grandiose title, because I'm talking about, well, first, cryptography in general, and in fact, what I'm going to be focusing on is a more restricted area called cryptographic protocols. And second, I could have made it more grandiose. If I, instead of proof of work, I would have said blockchain era, which is catchier. Except that here I'm gonna be focused on blockchains, but those that are enabled by this object primitive that we call proof of work. And this, the bulk of the material is joint work with Angelos Kiayas, Rafi Ostrovsky, Yorgos Panagiotakos, and Vasilis Zikas. All right, so I mentioned cryptography. By the way, so I have quite a few slides, which I'm not planning to cover. Hopefully, get to the 2/3 of the talk, and I'll flash through. But keeping them made this talk hopefully a coherent unit. All right, so I mentioned cryptography, which we know how modern cryptography relies on. That's one-way functions, where computing them in one direction is easy, computing is in the inverse direction is hard. And what's easy means is some polynomial time, right? Time n to power c for some c, and inverting it is challenging, which means it's not inversion is not polynomial. All right, so it's a basic notion that cryptography relies on. And this notion, enables things that a lot of things that we know of, such as public key cryptography. You can encrypt and you can sign digitally and so forth. And in turn, public key cryptography enables, interaction between parties, and that's what we call cryptographic protocols. Cryptographic primitives. Right. So, brief introduction to blockchains. So what is that they enable? The problem that originally tried to solve was digital money transfer, and for that we need a ledger, okay? And this is a ledger or bulletin board, and because it's a blockchain, it's a concatenation of blocks, right? Starting with something called Genesis block, and in these blocks you have simple transactions or more complex contracts, so-called smart contracts. Content of the blockchain is provided by anybody with sufficient funds. It's readable, so anybody can read it. It's immutable in the sense that no modifications are possible after a while. And there should be some notion of time so that this blockchain grows and transactions are included. Okay, so effectively what this blockchain is doing is implementing a distributed ledger where the the parties on the right emulate what should be a centralized ledger on the left. And there are two properties that are usually required of these ledgers. And one is consistency, meaning everybody sees the same thing, and liveness, that there is progress. Everybody can undo transactions. Right, so that was a brief introduction. Now I'll just talk for hopefully 5 minutes about POW-based blockchains, POW is proof of work. Then I talk about a framework that we introduced to capture what's going on. And it turns out that realizing these primitives, proof of work, in the standard model, and we'll see what that is a bit more challenging than we originally thought. And hopefully I'll get to that as well. All right, but I wanted to mention that there is some effort in realizing these things. All right, so proof of work based blockchains, how does it work? There are miners doing work, quote unquote, to install transactions, transaction organizing blocks, as I mentioned, and there's a chain of blocks. And in blocks, the block kind of looks like this: a link hash of the previous block, some data, and the proof of work. Okay, so the data could be transactions, transfer of Bitcoin, and the proof of work is that what we are focusing on. All right, these are transactions look like, a bunch of fund transfers, and the proof of work is in the way it's implemented is a exhaustive search using a hash function, trying to find a value such that when you apply the hash function, it's smaller than a certain threshold. Okay, this is not important to read this code, but this essentially what this conveys. The hash function that is used is 256, and if somebody is one of the miners is able to find this value, then it will broadcast to the rest of the network. So I found a block and decided transactions that I'm installing. All right, so this is what we call the proof of work era, roughly the last 10 plus years, where after the introduction of Bitcoin. Okay, and what is this proof of work object? It goes back to a few years, like 20 years or so, and this was introduced by Dwork and Naor, also from Weizmann Institute, and it kind of involves two parties, right? A prover and a verifier. Okay, and the prover is trying to do work, you do some computation, and the verifier is hanging out there. So yeah, sure, okay. So let me know when you're done. I'll verify this, right? And notice that I steps in red because it's related to what I'll be talking about. About not being arbitrarily polynomial running time, but more concrete. Okay, so abstractly, this proof of work can be formulated as a predicate, right? Where some of the arguments are known, and then one has to search for, the other argument, right? Call that the witness, and that takes a long time. Okay, and we need to assume a lower bound on how much work this would entail. And if I get to the last part, this is related to, exciting, relatively new topic of fine-grained complexity. And importantly, verification of this predicate is easy. And also importantly, for the purpose of blockchains, is that you don't always get, the prover doesn't always get lucky, but it succeeds with some small probability. Okay, so this has been around for a while, a lot of applications, spam mitigation, civil attacks, denial of server protection, and so forth. But the most impactful application is the design of blockchain protocols. All right, and here's repeating the expression that I had. Okay, so and why does this work? Is because miners, parties are trying to build this blockchain. The decision is is about the longest chain that the miner receives, right? So if it has a chain, receive a longer chain, it will drop it and get a new chain. And it turns out that when the transaction is sufficiently deep in the blockchain, then there's nothing else the miner can do. Okay, unless he cannot modify things unless he has a majority hashing power. Okay, that's the basics. And here's something that we introduced back in 2015. We identify the basic properties of this of a blockchain, and those are common prefix, which captures the fact that what I just said, that everybody is looking at the same prefix of the blockchain. Chain quality, it has to do with ability of parties to contribute their input. And chain growth captures the fact that if parties do work, the blockchain is going to grow, right? So we did this, introduced these basic properties, and then based on these properties, can we show how applications running on top of the blockchain can be obtained. And those basic applications are transaction ledger, okay, which I mentioned at the beginning, all right? And another important problem in cryptography and distributed computing called consensus. Now I'm going to go briefly about consensus a little bit, and then which highlights this example, what the new things that proof of work brings to this space. Right, consensus is a traditional problem dating like 30, 40 years, where there are M parties, some of them are corrupted. There's very consensus protocol, and they all agree on the output is the same, regardless of what the corrupted parties do. Okay, and there is another version close relative to this problem called broadcast, where instead of multiple parties having an input, just have one sender sending values, having an input, and everybody has to agree. Okay, regardless of what the other guys do, and even if the sender, it might be himself or herself malicious. Okay, so the properties that this solution to this problem should satisfy is validity. If the sender was honest, then that has to be the outcome. And consensus or agreement, that means that everybody has the same value. And the protocol should terminate. And I should say that in the consensus problem, the validity condition says if all the honest parties have the same input, then that should be the outcome. Okay, this has been around, as I said, for a while, but it had become quite a bit of new interest with the advent of blockchains. And this problem is a fundamental instance of something called secure multi-party computation, which has this definition. It's a more general version of the problem where you have n parties also trying to do some computation, and the computation should be correct, and it should be private, regardless of what the bad guys do. All right, and I mentioned this MPC thing later on. All right, so far so good. So how many, I mentioned a number of parties, a number of corrupted parties. How many parties can a solution to this problem tolerate? And it turns out that early on, when the problem was introduced by Lamport et al., they showed that this cannot be done if T, the number of corrupted parties, is equal or more than a third. All right, and here is a little picture that would represent this, where a party sends, this is the sender, right, sends two messages, and in blue I have a party that is corrupted. Okay, so he sends two messages, and they compare notes. Like he said, well, this guy says he attack, and the other guy says he retreat. Okay, so from this guy's point of view, in order not to violate the validity property, he has to attack. And here's another scenario where instead the sender is corrupted, all right, and says now two conflicting messages, the same situation is the same underneath, and therefore this guy has to again attack, and by symmetric reasons, then this guy has to retreat. Okay, so the two guys are going to output different things. So that's a sketch of the impossibility, and I get back to that later. Okay, and this is assuming that there's no cryptography used. Okay, so such as digital signatures, and this is the impossibility I just showed you, because a guy can lie arbitrarily. And then the question is, can this bound be improved if we use cryptography, such as PKI, public key infrastructure, which we're going to call a private setup, Okay, it turns out that you can, but you cannot do better than this map. Okay, so recall there's a minority of parties can be corrupted to achieve this problem. Right, and this is summarized here. Private setup means you have a PKI, you can use crypto, okay, and you have this condition, less than a minority of corruptions. Apologize for the noise. And when there is no private setup, think of say a Genesis block, some common string in the sky, right? That you cannot do broadcast because in this case, so you have these bounds, okay? And it turns out that this last impossibility was shown by a paper by Borkelden that says that when you have crypto but you don't have PKI, you cannot do better than this. Same as in the case of you not using crypto. And here's the proof. I'm not going to go over the picture, but kind of resembles the type of scenario that we saw before. The gray guys are the corrupted guys, and they lie. Okay, so and essentially saying crypto is not useful if you don't have a PKI or a private state setup. Apologize again. Okay, and this is summarizing this theorem that is saying you have a public setup and you don't, never mind what these terms are, you throw added a lot of crypto and so forth, but you cannot do better than this fraction. All right, and then we knew this over 20 years ago, except that now Nakamoto comes and says, I think I can do better than that by using a proof of work chain. Right. This is from an email thread that he had. We're not going to go over it, but basically says you try to attack a Wi-Fi network. If everybody attacks at the same time, you're going to be able to break it. Okay, it turns out that this doesn't work because it doesn't care about the validity property. But the initial protocol suggestion was now you have a Genesis block and you try to input, the transactions would be their input to the consensus problem. And he says, well, if you're doing this, if you receive a longer chain, you switch to your input. Okay, and when the blockchain is long enough, then you output the existing unique value. All right, it turns out that this doesn't work because with a non-negligible probability, the adversary, can get one of his parties, to input the value first, and everybody's going to switch that value. Right? Now, we slightly improve this, right, by just making a slight change. That's saying you try to, keep including your input. Okay, you get a new chain, you switch to that chain, but you don't give up your input. And it turns out that in this case, you can achieve consensus with a constant fraction of parties. Okay, so this small variation tolerates 1/3, but you can do better, okay, by using more sophisticated versions of this primitive called 2-for-1 proofs of work. Okay, so in another paper, but with the Kiayas, we look at all these, how consensus can be achieved in the classical setting and in the proof of work, blockchain setting, this to the left and to the right. And the apparent contradiction is this red line and the green line. But in particular, if we look at the blue lines here, it turns out that we can achieve consensus with different kinds of setup, right? So we need private setup on the left and public setup on the right. Okay, and we still tolerate a minority of parties. All right, so this is a curious thing. How does this happen? And we explained that with the second part. This is resource-restricted cryptography, where we capture what's going on. All right, so recall this impossibility that I mentioned. Okay, this only works because a corrupted party can send two conflicting messages for free. All right, and in this resource-restricted way, when you cannot generate messages at will, this one cannot happen. Okay, so this type of scenario you cannot play. Okay, so, and this is the type of problem scenarios that we've had for a long time from the introduction, all right, which I mentioned. And the resources that were restricted, okay, were many, including computational power, sequential computational power, space, state, and so forth. Okay, and we capture all this by this framework in which we are able to restrict one resource, all right? And we can explain this by capturing access to the network, all right, which mimics, models the fact that parties are trying to generate a proof of work and send it to a network, but they're all going to be able to do it with some probability, not at will. Okay, and these are all the properties of this what we call wrapper. And it turns out that this, capturing this in the formal way, allows us to, never mind all the evolution of all the transformation that we had to do. But it turns out that you can do MPC, secure multi-party computation, arbitrary computation, tolerating a minority of corruptions. This is what it says, the theorem. All right, so far so good. So we are able to explain this apparent contradiction. And now we're going to say, okay, so we look at this proof of work in a sort of ideal way, see what it does. But let's see, we're trying to instantiate that in a more concrete, practical way. All right, so it turns out that what we saw, this PAUS protocols using PAUS that are based on hash functions, use something called a random oracle, model such functions as a magic ideal random function. Okay, so it's an ideal object there that the miner, sends a value and gets an output back. All right, so it's a very useful for analysis, but it turns out this random oracle approach is not always, secure, and therefore we're gonna try to do more, instantiate, realize these things based on other properties. All right, so recall what the definition of monolithic hard functions we had. And this has been, we have two parties, prover and verifier, where, proven is expensive, was mentioned, verify is much easier, some other properties, completeness. But when you want to capture properties of this primitive for blockchain, it, is much more elusive, right? Because you need other properties such as amortization resistance, which is a common property, meaning if you solve a puzzle, you're not able to solve the next puzzle, more easily. We also want, some sort of independence, right? Everybody has a chance, and we need the high rate of success of honest parties to do this and so forth. So properties, you need more than the basic two properties, and this, it turns out that it's challenging to achieve in the standard model. Okay, so this is here are the two attempts that in which we made progress. One is realizing this from non-idealized hash functions. Okay, this is a paper with Kiayas and Panagiotakos. This was in TCC last year. Okay, so instead of random oracle, we look at the hash function with some concrete properties. Okay, and these properties are, some of them are standard, some of them are somewhat standard. That's why I had standard in quotes. Okay, but in particular, things like collision resistance will be standard. Okay, so we are able to do this. We don't get to what the optimal, the best we could get, but this is progress. That's one thing. And the other approach is based on fine-grained complexity. Remember, I mentioned that before. Recall I mentioned cryptography, one-way function and so forth, arbitrary polynomial, time. And what fine-grained complexity introduces is allows us to talk about adversaries in a more refined model. So we have a classical adversary that runs in arbitrary, polynomial time. But in the fine-grained case, it's fixed. Okay, you cannot do better than say that n square or n cube. Okay, and this is the exciting area of fine-grained complexity, where looks at problems, right, that are in polynomial time, but you can say very specific things about the running time. Okay, so say time t, and you can show that you cannot solve this problem better than say t to 1 minus epsilon. All right, this is a bit around. People have been around to these problems for a while. So this coalescing it into finite complexity is a more recent result by the Vasilevska, Williams, and others. Right, but it turns out that for many natural problems, this brute force approach, right, is essentially optimal. And examples are of these problems are orthogonal vectors and all pair shortest paths and so forth. Because we can say specific things about the running time, upper bound and lower bound, right? So the idea is to now use these problems, okay, to realize a proof of work. And this is just to give you an idea what this problem would be on this slide by Marshall Hall. And basically it says you have a bunch of vectors, okay, n vectors, okay, of certain size, and you have to find two such that their product is 0. All right, and there are very concrete bounds for what's the best and worst you can do, to solve this problem. All right, and this was actually used by Ball et al. To show that if you assume, right, there's a conjecture that you have this running time, then you can realize n squared paths, right? So, and that's why recall I mentioned I had steps in red in the definition of proof of work. Okay, so. But that proof of work here, the issues here are, how to change a worst case analysis to an average case and so forth. And that gives you the basic properties, but it doesn't give you all the other properties that I mentioned we need for blockchain friendly proof of work. And this is what we are doing, in follow-up work, assuming we are using proof of work, orthogonal vectors to use proof of work, and we can show how to achieve consensus, and consensus permissionless, meaning there are no IDs, with a public setup. Okay, it's the same type of thing, but now instead of having a random oracle, we are able to realize the proof of work, with a very concrete computational assumption. Right? Here, and this is the CF is referencing two related works. One is by the next speaker, Stefan Zimbowski, and something else that we did later on. Right. So summary, what have I talked about? I talked about proof of work, powerful primitive, and it turns and show that using this proofs of work, you have protocols that challenge long-established impossibility results. I mentioned this resource-restricted framework, cryptography framework, which captures this phenomenon. We show how to do consensus MPC, tolerating a minority, the optimal number of corruptions. And I also briefly mentioned attempts to realize this primitive in the standard model, right? So far so good. What's happening next, right? So it turns out that this observation can be applied to other lower bounds impossibility results in crypto. And another possibility is now we model this, we have this wrapper functionality to model access to a resource. You can think about implementing this to other resources as well. Okay, so finally, references. The resource-restricted cryptography paper was in Eurocrypt 2020, available here. The attempt to realize proof of work with non-idealized hash functions, TCC, can be found here. I mentioned this picture with apparent contradiction. This is in the consensus taxonomy in the blockchain era. And some follow-up work we use with Cohen and Zikas. We also look at the problem of adaptively secure broadcasts, which has some known impossibility results, and we're able to bypass them using resource-restricted cryptography approach. And the last thing that I mentioned as ongoing work is the consensus from proofs of work in the standard model. With that, I like to wrap up. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Garay. And I think that on top of the so practical outcomes and takeaways on this research, I can take also something for life. I think that I can try to improve to be less the prover person and more the satisfier person. I think this is the verifier, sorry, person. I think this is a good takeaway for life from you also, which is not exactly only in cryptography. I would like to ask really a short question, since we have a number of participants on our audience this week that are very interested in the cyber arena of attacks and things like this, and we see how the Bitcoin became the channel or the asset that the attackers use it mainly in the ransomware attacks in order to use it as the way for the victims to pay them and to enjoy the fact that it's not easy to track it. And we see that by becoming so popular recently in the last attack of the Colonial Pipeline, we heard that the government succeeded to track back the money that was paid via the Bitcoin. So on this kind of a debate or challenge, how your research can shed some more light, or the takeaways may be relevant to this debate.
Right. So these are problems you're referring to. So you're able to track. So here we assume that all the participants are, ideally anonymous, right? And this in practice is not the case. There is work, trying to figure out how you can trace, these accounts and where they go and so forth. And this uses like networking, tools and so forth. What is more challenging here is that I mentioned the security, to achieve security properties of the blockchain, we need a majority of, honest parties. So that means parties that are following the Bitcoin protocol. And it turns out that if you look at the map, the pie of miners, right, you see there are huge chunks that are like mining pools. And if 2 or 3 of them colluded, this property would not be satisfied. So I think that that's a main that's a main issue that one has to capture, and that this approach is not capturing, because we just assume adversary with some assumption and so forth, which is idealized, and in practice you can do worse. But on the flip side, the analysis that I showed, holds for arbitrary attackers, right? It's a minority, but they can do whatever they want. In practice, what they would like to do is make money, right? And there's work, and then there's analysis, there's work showing that if all you care about is making money, then you can do much better than this minority thing, and that captures the mining pool situation.
Great. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.